Muchas gracias a Jorge, a Juan, a todos los organizadores. Sí, muchísimas gracias y gracias a ustedes por venir, por estar aquí después de un día tan largo. Voy a hablar de atención y ojalá tengan energía y atención para poner atención a un tema que es muy aburrido, pero que es muy central en filosofía. Y lo que voy a, I'm going to switch to English because my slides are in English. There's terms that I only know how to really understand in English. And I'm going to just briefly tell you what's the sort of bigger background discussion that I have in mind, just so you know why I decided to talk about this. The topic is really this, attention and communication. But of course, communication and cognition need to be defined in a little bit more precise way. So I'm going to talk about the role of attention in common ground in communication, which is a task that is very interesting and intriguing, and it's essential for any kind of intelligence. And in the background, what I have in mind is the biggest agenda is to try to present, and this is a topic that has come up in a few talks previously, try to understand or try to assess the possibility of creating an epistemology that has all the virtues and the advantages of traditional Western epistemology that focuses on inference, rationality. Since Aristotle came up in one talk, good reasoning, justification, evidence, all the goodies that you want from Western epistemology, but not centered on belief. Right? So not centered on the notion of belief that is justified under some conditions, but rather that is focused on attention. So that's the biggest thing. Then another thing that I think is actually an implication of this move, and you can see this very clearly with some recent books, like particularly Jonardon Ganeri's book on Buddha Gosa and the Buddhist tradition and why attention is the central epistemic notion in Indian Buddhism. What comes pretty clear from that book is that you don't need phenomenal consciousness to have all these goodies. Okay, so that's going to be a topic here. What is the value of consciousness if consciousness is not necessary for this? And of course, consciousness is going to be valuable for other things. I'm not denying, it would be pretty stupid, I think, to deny that consciousness has enormous value. I just don't think its value is epistemic, the way we have thought. Okay, so that's the kind of big thing. Now I'm going to talk about pretty boring things, because that's how this goes. Just as a general set of issues, attention is hard to define. It's not as hard to define as phenomenal consciousness. Attention is much better. It's kind of interesting to compare attention and consciousness, because attention is pretty well understood in psychology, not only in human psychology, but in animal cognition. And it's been one of the main capacities that has been studied systematically in psychology since the very beginning of psychology. Attention, for example, I mean, William James says all sorts of things, but one of the main things, he says that attention is a very important capacity. So these are just kind of broad definitions of attention that you find in the literature. And you will see that I tend to favor a view of attention that conceives it as a kind of mental action. And you will see why that matters in a second. So here's one very broad way. This is the broad way that, for example, my collaborator with a funny name, well, not funny. It's not funny. It's very difficult to pronounce name, Haladian, and I use in our book with MIT Press. It's a selective capacity. It's a capacity to select contents, right? And it's not a trivial selective capacity. It's a selective capacity that really guides our cognition. And it's context dependent, it's evaluative, and it allows us to assess situations and contents. So it allows us to evaluate, and it allows us to access contents. Right? So this is an important capacity. In the earliest stages, attention allows you to pay attention to something that is really urgent. For example, I'm doing something really weird now, but that's because I want to get my phone and not lose track of time, which is something I tend to do. So attention is really helpful to parse information that is overwhelming and big. So we heard a talk where we were told, you need only this tiny space of and this array of information to get a really rich phenomenology of vision, right? And that makes it sound like our visual contents are sparse. But there's a huge debate in psychology and philosophy of perception about how rich the phenomenology of perception is and how many things we can pay attention to when we perceive. You have this option right now. You can pay attention to what I'm saying, or you can pay attention to my face. Maybe I'm making a funny face. You can pay attention to the tree outside. You can mind wander. These are options that you have available. But even just when you're looking at something, you can decide what to pay attention to. But the earliest forms of attention allowed us to select certain contents in favor of others. Right? This is important.
He's popping the microphone a lot. Could you hold it slightly further?
Yes, sorry. Better?
It just kind of bangs a bit.
Okay. This is better? Maybe I should use this thing. Well, I don't know. So it is a paradigmatic kind of mental action. Okay, so the first definition is I'm actually have a pretty loud voice, so I wonder if I could just can I just not use this?
Yeah.
It's better if I don't use it. Yeah. Okay, so far you've understood what I've said. Okay, good. And I know how to yell because I am a teacher, so as many of you. So so it's a selective capacity, but it's not just. Many people think it's just selection. It's not just selection. It's always selection for something. So someone who emphasizes these two things is Wayne Wu. I mean, I'm going to talk about Wayne Wu at some point, but I'm not assuming his definition of attention. He himself doesn't think he's original in his definition. He calls his definition a Jamesian definition of attention. So these two characteristics, that attention is selective, and it's selective in a way that gives you a choice at the personal level. So it is you who is paying attention, not your retinas. And that attention is active, that it's a kind of action. These are two characteristics of the William James definition, which I'm not going to go into that. But so it's a kind of paradigmatic mental action that is responsive to problem solving. So it's very sensitive to problems and their complexity, or it's very sensitive to context and what's relevant in context or salient in context. And because of that, it's an ability that we and animals have, many animals, insects even. And it's an ability, like any real ability, that is attributable to us as agents. Right? Again, this is not some thing that my retina is doing or some part of my hippocampus. It's an ability that I have and that you have. It's a kind of cognitive focus. This is another definition. That is required. This kind of cognitive focus emphasizes something that came up in other talks. It's a kind of mental energy. Right? So when you meditate, you're focusing your attention. Maybe you're not focusing your attention because you want to achieve a certain goal, but you're expending energy because you're attending to something, whatever you're meditating on, or just you're spending time meditating. You can also spend time on a mathematical problem. Your focus is on that problem, and that means your attention is absorbed. So it's a kind of focus required to maintain mental energy. And in perception, one thing that John Campbell, for example, has emphasized. I mean, John Campbell has been pioneer in the relationship between attention and semantics. Is that this is the way we secure, for example, demonstrative reference. If I say this glass here was produced in Cuernavaca, I'm referring to this particular object, and I'm drawing your attention to this specific object, not some possible object in the room, this very object. And it's this very object that we can focus on and pay collective attention, joint attention, right? And then we're coordinating our mental efforts. It's a complex and an interesting capacity. So we can spend a lot of energy focused on something, paying attention, but there are forms of attention that are effortless. And there's a whole literature that shows that the most complex tasks that we perform, very advanced math solving or very advanced piano playing, involves a kind of attention that doesn't feel effortful, right? So it is not true that attention is synonymous with effort. It is in some cases, but there are very interesting cases of attention. This is called effortless attention, or the Soviet early psychologists, the students of Pavlov and all those guys that were called the activity theorists. These guys call this kind of attention post-voluntary attention, the kind of attention that you gain through enormous skillful activity. Of course, they were Soviet psychologists. They thought this is the way we're going to free our labor and become really not alienated, right? Our attention is going to become post-voluntary. This is something that some people don't like, but you can think of attention because of all these characteristics as a kind of resource, like something that can get depleted or replenished. The relationship between consciousness and attention is tricky, but the idea is that many kinds of very important forms of attention are unconscious and are triggered unconsciously. And some of them may have a conscious component, like it feels good to be in flow. It feels good to climb a wall, self, and not feel effort. There's a phenomenology to that, but it's not like you're experiencing effort. It would be weird to say that the whole thing is conscious. A lot of it is unconscious. So I guess that's what I want to say about this. And that's because every time I talk about attention like that, right, slide number 3 is like, what on earth are you talking about? So that's the point of this slide. That's some of the key characteristics of attention. Now, attention, and this is the only slide I'm going to talk about this. This is the book that Jorge mentioned with Fairweather. This book is about how attention can be used to provide a kind of epistemology that Ernest Sosa calls virtue externalism, virtue epistemology with externalist components. So, for example, components where whether you're reliable or not really matters, right, in your performance. What I'm going to say today has nothing really to, I mean, it has something in the background, but what I want you to see is that attention has enough structure, because you can think of it as a disposition, just the way there are dispositional theories of belief. You can think about attention as something that gives you enough structure to give you what, and this is in the book, if you're curious about this, I don't want to spend time on these details now, but if you're curious, the 2 first chapters of this book are about how you can give what Frank Ramsey, in the very short life that he lived, called a success semantics. And in a success semantics, it's a kind of teleosemantics. What you have is a goal and a representation and what Ramsey calls a utility condition. And the idea is when you have goals and representations, he said goals and beliefs, plus utility conditions, and you add motivations, he said desires, but it could be any kind of motivation, you have enough fine structure to give you truth conditions, right? So the utility condition tells you that if you have a certain goal and you're motivated to pursue under a certain way of representing the world, the actions that you take to satisfy that goal tell you the truth conditions of the contents of the antecedent, okay? And the idea is attention has this structure. So if you want to pay attention to something, you need to represent the world in a certain way, and you need to be motivated to satisfy certain epistemic goals, typically represent the environment in an accurate way to perform actions on the environment. And the utility condition is satisfying those actions to fulfill your epistemic needs, right? So it's an adaptation of Ramsey, but what I want you to see quickly, I'm not giving you a lot of detail, is attention is not just selection. It has a rich enough structure that you can think of it in this way, sort of like a capacity or as a disposition. with enough structure to give you some success condition. And you don't need to, I mean, in the book we call it, Ramsey wanted to be a semantics, but you don't need to think of it as semantics. You can just think of it as success conditions. Success conditions for action. Right? Attention has a rich enough structure to allow you to provide those conditions. When is it that you're going to succeed? When is it that you're going to fail? Okay. Okay, so here's the super boring part. Attention, because it's a capacity that allows you to succeed, it is also a capacity that we and many animals use to reduce luck in our interactions. Okay. There's all sorts of luck. One type of luck is the kind of luck we heard about in the talk about syntax placing, the X position. So if we didn't do that kind of trick, we would not be able to map numbers the way we do. We would not be able to coordinate. That's one kind of luck. Another kind of luck is just failing to communicate, right? Or communicating just by chance. A big topic in the book with Fairweather is how attention is a source of luck reduction in action, coordination, but also in communication. And why communication is driven by success conditions that, of course, matter a lot for epistemology and intelligence. So attention plays a big role, and that's the topic of the talk, in being curious about what other speakers are saying, what's salient about what speakers say, what you should be curious, why you should not be curious, or as Edith Stein said, it's of the utmost importance to know what is and what is not your business. Inference, which is the boring topic here, language, and just in general, one thing that I think is interesting is that under certain ways of understanding intelligence, you need to be vulnerable to the environment. Ramsey's approach is amenable to that idea, but the one who has recently written about this is Damasio, Antonio Damasio and his colleagues, Mann and Niven, and they say that intelligence needs this kind of vulnerability, but this vulnerability is also, it comes for free if you have capacities that have success conditions that need to satisfy those conditions in environments and where luck needs to be reduced, right? On a personal level and interpersonal, right? And this creates many interesting things like hypothesis and joint attention. A meta hypothesis is just about what is relevant given the sort of hypothesis you have about the environment. So you can say, I have a set of concepts at the first level. Can I improve my concepts to learn something new? Right. So that is a question that requires the salience of certain tasks, the salience of certain content, and having a common sense notion of how to satisfy those meta goals is something that attention helps you achieve. Okay, so now epistemic agency. Okay, so this is different from all the things that I've been saying. So all that I've been saying is true, but it could be false that attention itself is a kind of agency, right? But what I want to, again, I don't have a lot of time to convince you here, but if you want to know more details, we can talk about them in the Q&A. But the idea is that attention is a skill. It's a very important capacity that you use to navigate the world. It's attributable to you, and it's something that you need essentially to be an epistemic agent. Right? The idea is if you lack this capacity, if you cannot pay attention to what is salient, if you cannot detect threats that are salient, if you cannot recognize what is important in a conversation, you would just fail as an epistemic agent in general, right? And so it needs to have these components that what you pay attention to is you're partly responsible to what you pay attention to, right? So it's supposed to be under your control, right? Again, this is not something your retina is doing, it's something that you are doing. You can find this in a normal conversation. Your friend can get really offended and say, you were not paying attention to what I was saying. And the idea is, you're responsible for that. You're supposed to treat me better or something, right? So there's a notion of responsibility that is attached to the autonomy of attention. So this is going to become relevant very quickly soon in the next slides. But the idea is not only that this is something you do, you're responsible for it, and it's a kind of autonomy that you have. Right? What you pay attention to, how you pay attention to it, is an expression of your autonomy as an epistemic agent. And of course, who you cooperate with, who you pay attention with, and who you care about paying attention with is also a kind of cooperation that you're also responsible for. So there's a kind of quick argument just to distinguish a little bit what is happening here from what things that, for example, that Wayne Wu does. And again, the emphasis with Wayne Wu is that he really focuses on philosophy of mind issues. Here I want to focus on intelligence, communication, and epistemology. But the idea is that epistemic normativity, by this I mean epistemic responsibility, attributing responsibility for what you do as a knower or as a cognizer, that requires, I mean, I take this to be indisputable, that the responsible agency requires some kind of epistemic norms, and that epistemic norms require, that the fact that you require agency necessitates some kind of intentional mental action. That's the structure of responsibility. That this will be clear very soon. This sounds like morality, but you will see that it really, really matters for cognition. Okay. And the claim is that attention is, I mean, this is a little bit strong. It says it's the only type of mental action that can underline this epistemic agency. I believe in this very strong claim, but I think it suffices if you say that it's sufficient. It really is okay if you think it's sufficient. Attention suffices to play this role. But if you take this one, the stronger one, then attention is necessary for epistemic responsibility. And unlike Wu, I don't assume that attention is involved in all kinds of intentional action, right? For Wayne Wu, agency is a manifestation of attention. For me, I won't focus on epistemic agency. Right? Other kinds of action, I mean, maybe he's right. I just don't know. I don't want to defend that claim. So the idea is there's this kind of strong argument that only attention can provide this, and this really matters for how to understand rationality and the project of giving Western style definition of knowledge, where you have justification, evidence, minus belief. That's the idea here. And this I briefly mentioned, but just very quickly, some epistemic achievements occur without phenomenal consciousness. Epistemic agency always necessitates attention. Therefore, phenomenal consciousness plays a limited role. This is kind of weak. You can say it plays very little role, but let's say it plays some limited role. It's not always involved. And the idea is that here attention is going to play the key roles. And an important consequence of this is that this is part of the idea of why belief is not going to be at the center of analysis, which is something people have discussed. I mean, I'm going to talk about that briefly. You have time at the end, but just think of Timothy Williamson's knowledge first approach, and that's kind of like in the background. Will someone tell me if I'm running out of time? Because I'm already that. Yeah? No, but you will tell me. Okay, good. Yeah, I know that I'm not, hopefully. Thank you. Okay, so inference. And I'm going to talk about Mr. Inference here, Paul Boghossian. So inference is important. I mean, I'm going to read, these are all quotes from Boghossian. But inference is important because it has played this incredibly important explanatory role in psychology and in philosophy and in epistemology. Besides what I'm going to read from Boghossian, just to give you some names, just some name dropping. Aristotle, Leibniz, von Helmholtz in psychology, right? Their views of perception and rationality all involve inference or some kind of inference. And from a paper that I published, but this is the quote from Boghossian. But the idea is we not only need to understand what inference is because we think it's super important, we also need to understand the psychology behind it, right? And this is the goal of the next, basically of the rest of the talk. And then I'll say something about communication. So I'm going to try to go quickly now. So there's a psychological part of inference, and then there's the connection that with the theory of rationality that makes this psychological process particularly important for epistemic responsibility. Just in a nutshell, I mean, basically all the things that I'm going to talk about Boghossian have to do with the fact that inferences are reasons for things we do, right? And so Boghossian says, in epistemology, we're obsessed with the idea that there are better or worse ways for you to manage your beliefs. Notice the emphasis on beliefs there. And that these ways reflect on your virtues as an epistemic agent. And we really are obsessed with inference. I mean, this is not an understatement. And this is critical for what I want to say, right? So Boghossian goes, what's inference? So inference is not an art. I mean, yeah, I have that here, so I'm just going to read this. Inference, and this is a quote from Boghossian, as I've characterized it, is mental behavior. Notice the language here, okay? So no longer do you have belief or anything. He says inference is mental behavior. For it to make sense to hold you responsible for your inferences, inferring has to be something you do and not just something that happens to you, okay? It has to be a mental action of yours, right? Something that you have control over and which you could have done differently had you thought it desirable to do so. Right? That's what he says about inference. And of course, belief is now no longer at the center of, actually, I think belief could not play this role at all. This is very boring. I was going to say it very quickly. There's these three problems. There's these three characteristics of inference that Boghossian really wants to capture. I am mentioning them because I think attention is way better at capturing these than the conscious state that Boghossian calls taking, which is what I want to talk about in a second. But the idea is that there's these three characteristics. Basing determines that agents establish premises as the reason for believing the conclusion. Quality is that given basing, the belief drawn from the premises can be assessed as resting on good or bad reasons. So it's like an assessment of how you base your conclusion or premises. And responsibility is based on these two properties and determines your responsibility for reasoning well or badly, for assessing it correctly or incorrectly. So he says, the two main characteristics of inference are these three things that have to do with responsibility and that it's a mental action. But what he literally says is you can't even get to this if inference is not a mental action. It has to be a mental action in the first place for you to be able to understand these three characteristics. Okay, this is important, the puzzle of distance. So the puzzle of distance is, and by the way, when Boghossian talks about why it's super important that inference is a mental action, he says, if it were not a mental action, it would just be an argument, right? Just a relation among premises, or something that wouldn't be conducive to moving from one content to another, right? So inference is this activity, right? Goes from contents or beliefs or whatever to conclusions. And the puzzle of distance is how is it that we arrive at a conclusion given that we have some premises? If you don't want to be like too formal here, how is it that we arrive at a conclusion in general, right? Susanna Siegel has these great examples where you don't even need to change the content. Here's a bottle of water. I infer that I believe there's a bottle of water. I went from perception to belief, right? I enter the room and I see this room and I conclude there's at least 20 people in this room. How is it that I do that, right? Now, in some cases, this is an incredibly difficult, tricky thing. Like, for example, in mathematical proof, right? How is it that we get to a conclusion given some premises? So this, by the way, this is taken from Wittgenstein. A lot of this is taken from Wittgenstein. It looks as though what is needed to reach the conclusion is that it shouldn't be too far a distance from the premises. That's why a proof can have 1,000 pages and be fine, and it can't, no one can draw that inference, right? No matter how good you are at math, that inference is too long a distance to be drawn, right? His example is Fermat's last theorem and the piano axioms. The piano axioms are just the axioms of arithmetic. So, and this is really important. To know that you've reached the conclusion, you need to have an appreciation of the fact that this is the conclusion that follows from whatever you're assuming, right? And he says, for this to not become a super task, this is language that he takes from Wittgenstein, it better be that for a wide range of inferences, this appreciation is non-inferential in character. Right? So whatever we do when we reach a conclusion, it better not be an inference, right? It better be something else. That, in particular, this appreciation shouldn't be an inference, because that's the kind of worms that Wittgenstein calls the rigorous problem. And that's the next slide, I think. Well, I'm going to try to skip the rigorous stuff, but Boghossian says, and this has to do with, and I'll promise I'll come to communication in a second, but he says that, by the way, how is it that communication is going to be relevant here? Communication is a form of inference, and we reach conclusions from what we're communicating, and the idea is that's not necessarily through conscious appreciation. So Boghossian says that the way to solve this difficulty is that there's an intuition that we take the conclusion, he calls it the taking condition, that we take the conclusion to follow from the premises by what he calls an intuition to the fact that the taking is true. Okay, so this is a conscious seeming that we have that the conclusion is true given the premises, and it's phenomenally conscious, in the sense that there's an experience associated with it. He says, this intuition is, and again, notice that there's no success condition here, right? Having an intuition that something is true doesn't require a success condition. Doesn't mean that the conclusion literally follows from, it's just that you take it to follow, right? And he says that's what you need to solve the distance problem, because it gives you an appreciation, but it also helps you to solve the rigorous problem, which he divides into these two different problems. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. But one big problem here, and again, think about lock in communication. We mentioned one aspect of locky communication, not be able to parse syntax in a language. There are many others, like not being able to understand the content of a language, or not being able to understand jokes and pragmatic implicatures, not being able to follow the Gricean maxims. So there's all sorts of levels where communication can become locky. But one huge problem with Boghossian's account is that there are some kinds of inference that completely qualify as inferences, right? They're formal inferences, actually. They're not the inference of the kind I was talking about, the kind of like, I think I have a stone in my mouth, or here's a bottle of water. They're not inferences of the perceptual kind. They're strictly formal inferences. This is a well-formed grammatical formula. This sentence of English is grammatical. This is not grammatical. So they count as inferences, and they're tacit from the very get-go. We never have conscious appreciations of the rule we're following. And we're never, this is the way it is going to sink in. We're never told these rules when we learn a language. They're implicit from the very beginning. And we never have, not only are we never told what these rules are, it's not true that our moms are equipped with a syntax book that tells us the syntactic structure to learn things as counting units, right? It's not only that that's not true, it's also true that we never have conscious intuitions about this. We just reach the conclusion that's grammatical, or that's not grammatical, right? How do you appreciate that? Well, I just, it's kind of unconscious. How do you know that you're succeeding? I'm able to communicate. I'm reducing lock with other, and I'm paying attention to the same formal features. So for Boghossian's formula to work, because of course Boghossian says all inferences start in the conscious appreciation kind, then they can become implicit and unconscious. But the problem with that is, this is what I'm saying, this is the challenge here. And again, this is just syntax, one specific part of language. I think this extends to many other capacities of communication and intelligence. They're just implicit from the very beginning. Okay, so a lot of our rationally guided behavior is never based on conscious intuition, and it's unconscious. It takes, for example, linguists years of training to explicitly appreciate. We saw that today. Which rules are these? And typically, one only tacitly follows the principles that allow us to draw conclusions about grammaticalness. Okay, see, this is a little bit repetitive. I'm going to skip it. Okay, so why is attention so important here? First of all, I think that the best way to understand the kind of mental action that Boghossian is interested in is not through the phenomenology of intuition, whatever that is, by the way, but as the kind of action that attention provides, because it's selective, it can be implicit, it's purposeful, and it guides your mental behavior. And as I showed you from the very beginning, that's how James thought of attention, right? So this is not something we're inventing to address this problem. This is in the very nature of attention. Phenomenal states of intuition, or the intuition of a belief following from others, are not the best way of understanding mental action, because intuition can be understood as something that is passive, right? Something that is happening to you. You can have a passive intuition of, oh yeah, I kind of think that's true, or it feels true. God knows if it's true, or whether I'm going to be able to coordinate or triangulate. But that just kind of happens, right? So you don't have that problem with attention. And moreover, this explains why animals and infants have communicative capacities, right? It's not a mystery why bees can communicate. They don't need phenomenal intuitions about taking conditions that take a conclusion from the consciously perceived, assessed premises to follow. That would be pretty bad for bees, right? And in general, this kind of approach to inference explains heuristic reasoning. There are other good things about thinking this way. So attention is a kind of capacity that allows us to explore. So you can make sense of synthetic norms. These are norms for when to open and close inquiry, when it's a good idea to start thinking, oh, maybe this is a good thing to think about. I'm going to start thinking about how to go to Rome, and how much time you want to spend doing that, and how many inquiries you want to open. That kind of thing is best understood as what I want to pay attention to, and how many things I want to open as attention routines, than just a set of intuitions. It's related to bias. I mean, so this is Siegel again. She talks about inference, but my suggestion is you can replace what she says about inference with attention routines. And actually, her book, that's 2017, The Rationality of Perception, it's easy to read that book as involving attention. Okay, so first big thing, controversial thing that I want to say is that I mean, the weaker thing is you can provide, I mean, I'm just doing one part of the big project, but you can provide an account of inference that is based on attention, that is superior to the conscious intuition one. There's not that much on the market, by the way. This approach can be part of a larger approach where attention is providing you good evidence, is allowing you to succeed, is allowing you to have success conditions to succeed your representational needs. It's rich enough that we can understand your epistemic agency. And it's a kind of epistemology that is compatible with a knowledge first epistemology, where you cannot analyze knowledge in terms of components like justified true belief. And moreover, it's an epistemology where belief is not at the center. Why would that be good? I mean, so first of all, it's good because belief is not factive, right? By its very nature, I can believe something that is false. That's why it's important that my beliefs are justified in epistemology. Attention is not like that. It's not like attention can misguide you. Attention can definitely misguide you. But attention, when it operates correctly, it satisfies success conditions. It's factive. Just think about perception. Good, well-working, typical perceptual attention is factive. And it's not only factive, it's the way John Campbell says. It's factive in a way that it secures the reg reference, the re reference. It's a strong connection to the environment. It's empirically, okay, so in recent epistemology, these are other things that I probably just mentioned. You can make the claim even stronger. Not only is attention good and replacing some doxastic ways of understanding knowledge are also good, it might be a more comprehensive theory of rationality. That's Georgie Gardiner. It's important. There are experiments that show you why attention is selective, why attention is factive, why it's a kind of mental action, why you find it in communication across species, etc. These are not just intuitions. These are things you can back up with experiments. I think it's a better explanation of many things that epistemologists, both externalists and internalists, have pointed out, but particularly internalists, like you have to be responsible for your inferences. I think attention gives you a better explanation of that. And that's really important for the internalists. And it gives you, and this is something that connects with ethics and with a better life and with a kind of providing a better, more politically sensitive epistemology, an alternative way of conceiving of non-colonial epistemologies. Amya Srinivasan's very, very important paper, Radical Externalism, where she says that she doesn't really talk about attention, but she says that the kind of externalist thing that I think is super compatible with attention gives you a broader kind of sensitivity to social structures and things like structural injustice. Okay, so am I doing okay? 20 minutes. Okay, wow, Jesus. Okay, wow. So maybe I should go back. Yeah, no, but I want to give some room for questions. So maybe I should 10. 10. Okay, yeah, 10 sounds good. So I'm going to talk much slower now. If you want me to go back, then I can go back. But okay, I don't know how familiar you're with this. I'm very sorry. You know, many of you are not philosophers, but if you read, like many of us did, the tragic Gettier problem literature, this was part of the frustration of Tim Williamson. So like that, it was just such a waste of time. And it's not that it was a waste of time. It's just that it was clear at some point that coming up with the fourth condition, right? Justified true belief are necessary but not sufficient. Coming up with that other condition was just a nightmare. We came up with way too many theories. Nothing really made sense. We always came up with things like you need to be sensitive. You need to, your sensitivity needs to be context, it needs to be world involving the worlds that are relevant. We kept using words like relevant, sensitivity, selectivity, non-lucky sensitivity, right? Well, why? I mean, why should we, instead of coming up with all these formulations that appeal to capacities that are attentive, sensitivity, selectivity, with the cross-world thing, I don't know how, but you can spell that in terms of attention. Why not just think that what's needed here is to just express that capacity as the central capacity in our epistemology, right? to articulate that in our epistemology in a better way. So it's good to think of knowledge first as, and after the experimental approaches that show that, for example, different cultures, different epistemic traditions came up with different assessments of whether people really knew or not, given the JTB intuition. So these are not stable intuitions. That's why, by the way, that's another huge problem with Boghossian's approach, that intuitions of the conscious phenomenal kind are just not stable cross-culturally. And communication of the basic kind, of the I need you to understand that I'm speaking English grammatically kind of thing, those need to be stable cross-culturally, because otherwise we will not be able to communicate or translate. So after all that, it's a good thing to at least think about replacing this traditional JTB approach with an attention first approach. And the idea is that it provides a theory of knowledge that is at least conceivable and coherent, right? It's a theory that, but just that, it makes it important just to explore, right? It may not be superior. I think it's way superior, but just the fact that it's conceivable and coherent is something that we should think about, right? I also think it has very important, and that's the talk so far. It has important consequences for how we think about epistemic agency. And I think it's actually the best candidate for developing this alternative theory. It has, I don't know if I have Ganeri somewhere here, maybe not. But what I wanted to say about Ganeri is that, oh yeah, cross-cultural studies. So Ganeri's book, by the way, the title is very confusing because it's called Attention, Not Self. And you would think it's about the Buddhist teaching that there's no self, but there's attention. But it actually is a book on epistemology. And I think it's a book on it's ostensibly, it's like, that's the account that Ganeri defends, is an externalist view of knowledge that relies on attention. And it argues that is the best way to understand non-Western traditions of the kind he's interested, the Buddhist tradition. So has that advantage too, right? And what is kind of depressing, I don't know that is depressing, but what is curious is that it's not clear anymore what is the role of consciousness in all this, right? I don't want, obviously, to deny that it has epistemic. One strong claim is to say consciousness has no epistemic value. It just doesn't cook epistemic breath. It doesn't help much in reducing epistemic lock. It makes our lives interesting. It makes our lives valuable, but in a different way. Maybe. I don't want to go that far. I think it just has a limited role. By the way, there's people that think, like Boghossian, that, so this is something that Declan Smithies says. He says, if you are not phenomenally conscious, fully phenomenally conscious, the way we are phenomenally conscious, with the kind of experiences that we were talking about in Susan's presentation, you're a zombie, a philosophical zombie. You don't even have beliefs. You have no epistemic life. And I think if you compare that with this, I think that's, well, I'll just leave it as a homework for you. I think that claim is crazy. But I like Declan. I mean, you need people like him to get traction in philosophy. But I think it's too, it takes the value of consciousness too, because it makes phenomenal consciousness, even though it's supposed to be private, not only the necessary condition for epistemology, but sort of like a complete demarcation of possible intelligent agents. Right? So that's where I'm going to go now. Like, what else follows from this? But just quickly, I think it plays a more limited role. It may temper the opening of inquiry. It provides familiarity with the contents that we engage in. So one thing about Mary, if you don't know about Mary, I apologize, but Mary is a well-known, this is a thought experiment, of course, only philosophers can come up with, knows everything about color. She's omniscient about color, but she's never experienced red. And the question is, she experiences red the first time. What is it that she learned? Well, she doesn't learn how to call red, right? People have pointed that out repeatedly. She doesn't learn how to say red or the syntax of red. She can communicate about color, and not only that, she's an expert. She knows a hell of a lot about red. So what is it that she learned? It doesn't sound like it's like she has no epistemic life because she hasn't experienced red. Colorblind people have pretty rich epistemic lives about color, right? So maybe she learns that now red is something familiar to her. What is that familiarity? Well, that's the card problem, right? But it's not epistemic, essentially, right? Okay, let's just move on. Yeah. Okay. Joint attention. I'm going to go quickly. I keep saying that, but I was given much more time that I should have taken, but not okay. Joint attention is something that comes up all the time with linguists and linguistic anthropologists. Is satisfying mutual inferential needs, satisfying mutual representational needs. It always happened in a sort of way of, Herbert Clark has a wonderful book, How to Use Language, where he says that even the way we synchronize our movements, the way we support each other in a conversation, not only follows the Gricean maxims, we really try to be honest and supportive. It's something that is super important to finally tune what we're jointly paying attention to. So one philosopher that takes this to the extreme, and I'm not endorsing, every time I mention Davidson, people go crazy. Donald Davidson, and I'm not endorsing him, says that unless you triangulate with other speakers through joint attention, you cannot have a notion of objectivity. You just don't know if there's objective stuff out there. Because all you have is your sensorial impressions, right? So communication in the wild, communication for real, linguistic communication really requires non-lucky joint attention, right? And it just sounds like there's no way you can get that out of conscious intuition. Okay, so I'll stop beating the intuition back. This is a book that I also did with Fairweather. It's an edited book, an edited volume. It's a commercial, so these two last slides are commercials. But they're commercials about things that follow from what I just said. Okay? The first commercial is a quasi-commercial. I don't have an article here. But it has articles by a lot of people that are all philosophers of language. And a lot of them say that, for example, syntactic log reduction seems to be completely different from semantic log reduction, guaranteeing the rare reference. This sounds like a completely different beast than securing syntax log reduction. And pragmatic log reduction, whatever that is, understanding that something is a joke versus an assertion, also requires that kind of thing. And then you can even get, there's no paper here because this is a very conservative, traditional book on philosophy of language. But Michael Silverstein also says that rituals, which require what he calls meta-pragmatics, understanding the purpose of a ritual, the meaning, which is not really the meaning of words, or it's a different thing, requires also log reduction and joint attention. Okay, so that's one thing that is important about this approach for theories of communication and intelligence. And then the last thing I want to say, and this I think resonates a lot with Barry's presentation, is that, and this is the last commercial, is that intelligence in general is purposeful. It's something that is attributable to us as agents. And it's attentive. A approach is that And I'm not talking about current, I completely agree with Barry that current systems are hopeless. But a consequence of this approach is that you don't need to be phenomenally conscious like us to be intelligent. Artificial intelligence is at least conceivable. It's not true that what we have now is artificial general intelligence, but it helps to know that there's at least a framework that makes that possibility at least conceivable, right? And I think I'm gonna stop now. Yeah, thank you.